The hardest part about being underestimated is not proving people wrong. It is realizing the people who doubted you were the ones you loved the most. I learned that lesson over many years, one quiet conversation at a time. My name is Ethan Brooks, and for most of my adult life, my parents believed I was barely getting by. They never said they were ashamed of me, but they did not have to. It showed in the questions they asked, the advice they repeated, and the disappointed look that appeared every time someone mentioned careers during family gatherings. My father, Richard Brooks, had spent more than 30 years building a respected construction company outside Columbus, Ohio. He believed success was something you could measure with a title, a large paycheck, and a corner office. My mother, Susan Brooks, admired his work ethic and usually agreed with his opinions, even when she tried to soften the way he expressed them. My older sister, Olivia, had become a successful attorney before turning 35, and every holiday dinner somehow included another story about one of her promotions, another important client, or another professional achievement. I was always happy for her because she worked incredibly hard, but eventually I noticed that every compliment directed toward Olivia was followed by another reminder that I should think about my own future more seriously. The strange part was that I already had. I simply chose not to explain it anymore. Years earlier, I had tried to tell my parents about my work, but those conversations rarely lasted more than a few minutes before someone interrupted with advice I had not asked for. My father would suggest another career path. My mother would recommend updating my resume. Someone always assumed I was looking for a better opportunity, even though I had never said I was unhappy. After enough conversations ended the same way, I stopped correcting them. It was easier to smile, change the subject, and let them believe whatever made sense to them. They assumed I rented a small apartment because I could not afford anything larger. The truth was that I enjoyed living close to downtown because it allowed me to walk to work. They believed I drove an older pickup truck because I could not buy a new vehicle. In reality, I liked my truck, it was fully paid for, and it had never given me a reason to replace it. Every assumption seemed to fit the story they had already created in their minds. To them, I was the son who had potential but never quite figured life out. I never argued because arguing would have sounded like bragging, and I had never been comfortable talking about myself that way. One Sunday evening, our family gathered for dinner at my parents' house, just as we had done countless times before. My mother prepared roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and homemade rolls. The house smelled exactly the way it had throughout my childhood, and for a little while everything felt familiar and comfortable. We talked about neighbors, the weather, baseball, and my sister's upcoming business trip to Chicago. Then, almost as if someone had followed a script we had repeated for years, the conversation shifted toward careers. My father looked across the table at me. "So, Ethan," he said while setting down his fork, "have you given any more thought to finding something with a little more stability?" I smiled politely because I had heard that question many times before. "I like where I am," I answered. He nodded slowly, but I could already recognize the expression that usually followed. "You are 34 years old now," he continued. "There is nothing wrong with wanting something bigger. You are smart enough to do more than scrape by." I quietly took a sip of water before responding. "I appreciate your concern, Dad." He leaned back in his chair. "Concern is part of being a parent. I just hate thinking that you are limiting yourself." My mother offered a gentle smile. "Your father only wants you to have security." Olivia glanced toward me for a moment, but remained silent. I could tell she wanted to avoid another familiar disagreement. The truth was that there was no disagreement anymore because I had stopped defending myself years earlier. Instead, I simply nodded. "Everything is fine," I said calmly. My father sighed. "Fine is not the same thing as successful." The room became quiet. My mother reached for the serving bowl as if changing the subject might erase the uncomfortable silence, but the words had already settled over the table. I looked at my father and realized he genuinely believed he was encouraging me. He was not trying to hurt me. He simply measured success differently than I did. That realization made it difficult to feel angry. Instead, I felt something closer to sadness because I knew he had no idea who I had become. After dinner, I helped clear the dishes while my mother wrapped leftovers. Before I left, she walked me to the front porch. "Your father worries about you," she said softly. "I know," I replied. "He just wants to see you doing well." I smiled. "Maybe someday he will." She hugged me before I climbed into my truck and drove back toward the city. The next morning I arrived at work shortly before 8 o'clock. My day filled quickly with meetings, project reviews, and planning sessions that would continue well into the afternoon. Around 11 o'clock, my phone buzzed. It was my mother. I stepped into a quieter hallway before answering. "Hi, Mom. Your father and I are coming into the city tomorrow," she said cheerfully. "We have a doctor's appointment in the morning, and afterward we thought maybe we could take you to lunch if you are free." "I would like that," I answered. "Great," she said. "Just send us the address where you work so we can pick you up." I looked through the glass wall beside me toward the busy office beyond it, then smiled to myself. "Sure," I replied. "I will text it to you in a few minutes." After we hung up, I sent the address without another explanation. A few seconds later, my father replied from my mother's phone with a short message that simply read, "We will come inside and meet you before lunch." I slipped my phone back into my pocket, completely unaware that tomorrow's unexpected visit would change a conversation my family had been having for nearly 10 years. The following morning began like any other workday, at least from my perspective. I arrived just before 8 o'clock, greeted the security team in the lobby, and took the elevator to the executive floor. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, downtown Columbus was already alive with commuters filling the sidewalks below. Inside the office, project managers gathered around conference tables reviewing reports while department heads prepared for the weekly executive meeting. I spent the first hour answering emails, reviewing financial projections, and meeting briefly with several team leaders before my assistant reminded me that the executive committee would be arriving shortly before noon. Everything followed a familiar routine. There was nothing unusual about the schedule except knowing my parents would stop by before lunch. Meanwhile, my father and mother finished their medical appointment earlier than expected. As they drove toward the address I had texted the previous afternoon, my father glanced at the navigation screen and frowned. "This cannot be right," he said. My mother looked out the windshield as one tall glass building after another appeared along the street. Maybe he made a mistake when he sent the address. My father slowed the truck as they approached the destination. The building rising before them was one of the most recognizable office towers in the city, home to several national companies and regional headquarters. Visitors entered through polished revolving doors beneath a wide canopy of glass and steel. Employees wearing business attire moved confidently through the lobby, while security officers greeted arriving guests. My father parked across the street and stared at the building for several seconds. "There is no way Ethan works here," he finally said. My mother looked at the address again on her phone. "It matches exactly." He shook his head. "Maybe he works for a cleaning contractor or a delivery company that services the building." My mother did not answer because she did not know what to think. They crossed the street together and entered the spacious lobby. The polished marble floors reflected the morning sunlight, and large digital displays listed the companies occupying different floors. My father quietly read several familiar corporate names before saying, "These are major firms." My mother nodded slowly. Maybe his office rents space here. They approached the reception desk where a professional-looking receptionist greeted them with a warm smile. "Good morning. How may I help you?" My mother answered politely. "We are here to meet our son, Ethan Brooks. He asked us to stop by before lunch." The receptionist typed briefly on her keyboard before smiling again. "Certainly. Please allow me one moment." She picked up the telephone, spoke quietly for a few seconds, then nodded. "Someone will be here to escort you shortly." My father looked surprised. He had expected someone to point toward a hallway or provide a visitor badge for a small office somewhere inside the building. Instead, less than a minute later, an elegantly dressed woman walked confidently across the lobby toward them. She appeared to be in her early 40s, carrying a digital tablet and wearing an identification badge. "Mr. and Mrs. Brooks?" she asked warmly. "Yes," my mother replied. The woman smiled. "Good morning. My name is Melissa Carter. Thank you for coming. Ethan asked that we make you comfortable as soon as you arrived." My father blinked in confusion. "You know Ethan?" Melissa smiled naturally. "Of course." She extended her hand. "It is very nice to finally meet both of you." My father shook her hand, but still seemed uncertain. "We are just taking him to lunch." "Yes," Melissa replied. "He mentioned that." She gestured toward the elevators. "Please come with me." As they followed her across the lobby, my father quietly leaned toward my mother. "She acts like she knows him well." My mother whispered back, "Maybe they work in the same department." They entered a private elevator requiring electronic access. Melissa tapped her badge against the control panel before selecting one of the highest floors in the building. My father noticed that no ordinary buttons were available without authorization. The elevator rose smoothly in complete silence. When the doors opened, they stepped into a spacious reception area unlike anything they expected. Large windows overlooked the city skyline. Modern artwork decorated the walls. Several assistants worked behind sleek desks while visitors waited in comfortable seating areas. The atmosphere felt calm, professional, and remarkably organized. Melissa led them toward another reception desk where a young assistant immediately stood upon seeing them. "Good morning," she said with a bright smile. "Would either of you like coffee, water, or tea while you wait?" My father politely declined. "We are fine. Thank you." Melissa looked toward the assistant. "Please let Ethan know his parents have arrived." The assistant smiled. "I already sent him a message. He is finishing one discussion before the executive meeting begins." My father heard the phrase but assumed he misunderstood. "Executive meeting?" Melissa nodded casually. "Yes, every Tuesday morning." My father forced a polite smile. "Our son is attending the meeting?" Melissa looked slightly puzzled before answering. "He leads it." My father laughed softly, convinced there had been some misunderstanding. "I think there must be another Ethan Brooks working upstairs." Melissa looked at him with genuine surprise before smiling. "No, sir. There is only one Ethan Brooks." My father exchanged a quick glance with my mother. Neither of them spoke. They simply followed Melissa through another set of secured glass doors into a quiet executive corridor. Along the hallway hung framed photographs recognizing company milestones, industry awards, and community projects. At the far end stood a large conference room enclosed almost entirely by glass. Before they reached it, Melissa gently lowered her voice. "The meeting has already started, so we will wait here until there is an appropriate moment." My parents instinctively looked through the glass wall toward the conference table inside. Nearly 20 executives sat around the room reviewing presentation screens filled with financial reports and strategic planning charts. At the head of the table stood a familiar figure speaking confidently while answering questions from every direction. My father froze. My mother covered her mouth with one hand. There was no second Ethan Brooks. Their son was standing at the front of the room leading the meeting, while the company's chief executive officer sat beside him listening with complete attention. Just as my parents struggled to understand what they were seeing, the chief executive officer slowly rose from his chair, smiled toward the room, and prepared to introduce Ethan before every executive seated at that table. The room fell completely silent as the chief executive officer stood and looked around the conference table with a relaxed smile. My parents remained outside the glass wall, unable to hear every word, but they could see every face in the room turned toward me. I finished answering a question about our upcoming expansion before stepping slightly to one side. The chief executive officer folded his notes and spoke with the confidence of someone addressing trusted colleagues. Even through the glass, my father could tell that everyone in the room was paying close attention. Then the chief executive officer extended one hand toward me and said something that caused several people to nod in agreement. Melissa quietly leaned toward my parents and whispered, "He is thanking Ethan for leading the transformation project. Today's meeting is recognizing the progress his team has made over the past year." My father stared through the glass without saying a word. The expression on his face had changed completely. The certainty he had carried into the building had disappeared, replaced by genuine confusion. He was trying to connect the son he thought he knew with the professional standing confidently before a room full of executives. A few moments later, everyone around the table applauded. It was not loud or dramatic. It was the kind of sincere applause that comes from people who respect the person standing in front of them. I thanked the group, answered one final question, and concluded the meeting. As the executives gathered their notebooks and laptops, several of them stopped to shake my hand before leaving the conference room. My parents watched each interaction carefully. Nobody treated me like a junior employee hoping to impress management. They treated me like someone whose opinion mattered. Melissa smiled as she noticed the meeting ending. "They will be out in just a minute," she said. My mother nodded quietly, but my father still seemed unable to speak. The conference room doors opened, and several executives walked into the hallway. One after another, they greeted me warmly before heading toward their offices. A few even noticed my parents waiting nearby. "Congratulations again, Ethan," one senior vice president said before smiling politely toward them. You must be his parents. You should be very proud. Before either of them could answer, another executive joined the conversation. Your son has made an incredible impact here. Working with him has been one of the highlights of my career. My mother thanked them softly while my father simply nodded. He looked as though he wanted to ask dozens of questions, but could not decide where to begin. Then the chief executive officer stepped out of the conference room, carrying a folder under one arm. He smiled the moment he saw my parents. I walked over immediately. Mom, Dad, I am glad you made it. My mother hugged me without saying anything. My father shook my hand almost automatically, still looking around the executive floor. I smiled because I could tell how overwhelmed they felt. Dad, Mom, I would like you to meet Daniel Harper. Daniel extended his hand warmly. It is a pleasure to finally meet both of you. Ethan talks about his family often. My father shook his hand. It is nice to meet you too. Daniel looked at me with genuine appreciation before turning back toward my parents. I hope Ethan has not kept us waiting too long. Tuesday mornings are always busy around here because he leads our executive strategy meetings. My father blinked. He leads them? Daniel smiled. Absolutely. Most of the operational improvements you see throughout this company began with Ethan's recommendations. He has built an outstanding leadership team. I noticed my father's eyes shift toward me for just a second before returning to Daniel. I did not realize. Daniel laughed kindly. Many people outside the company probably do not. Ethan has never been interested in drawing attention to himself. My mother looked at me with quiet surprise. Why did you never tell us? Before I could answer, Daniel continued. If I am being honest, he rarely talks about his accomplishments here either. Most of the credit he gives belongs to his team. I smiled slightly, hoping the conversation would not become uncomfortable. Daniel glanced at his watch. I have another meeting in a few minutes, but before I go, I want to thank you for raising someone with such integrity. Skill can be taught. Character usually cannot. After shaking their hands once more, he headed down the hallway. My parents stood silently for several seconds. Finally, my father looked at me. Can we see your office before lunch? Of course, I answered. We walked together through the executive corridor, passing offices with glass walls overlooking the city. My mother admired the artwork, while my father quietly observed employees greeting me by name as we passed. Several people stopped to ask quick questions about ongoing projects. Others simply smiled and wished us a good afternoon. None of it felt unusual to me, because this had become my daily routine years ago. Eventually, we reached my office. Melissa opened the door before returning to her desk. My father stepped inside slowly. The office was spacious but simple. A large desk faced the windows overlooking downtown Columbus. Bookshelves held leadership books, industry reports, and framed photographs from volunteer events sponsored by the company. One wall displayed certificates recognizing successful projects rather than personal awards. My father walked toward the window and looked back across the room. This is your office? He asked quietly. Yes, I replied. My mother noticed several framed pictures of our family sitting on a side cabinet. One showed all of us together at a Thanksgiving dinner years earlier. Another showed my parents celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary. She smiled gently. You kept these here. Of course, I answered. My father remained standing near the window, still taking everything in. Finally, he looked directly at me and asked the question that had clearly been building in his mind ever since they entered the building. Ethan, exactly what is it that you do here? My father stood quietly in the middle of my office, looking around as though every detail challenged something he had believed for years. My mother remained beside the bookshelf, her eyes moving from family photographs to framed project maps spread across one wall. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, I pulled out 2 chairs near the small meeting table by the window. Please, I said with a smile. Sit down. They both took their seats while I poured 3 glasses of water from the pitcher resting on the side cabinet. My father accepted the glass, but continued studying the room. I asked you a question, he said gently. What exactly do you do here? I sat across from them and answered the way I always had whenever someone sincerely wanted to know. I oversee operations for the company. My team works with every department to improve efficiency, manage long-term planning, and help new projects move from ideas into reality. Most of my job is solving problems before they become expensive ones. My father listened carefully. There was no trace of the confident certainty he usually carried. So, You are part of management? I smiled slightly. Yes. He looked toward the glass wall leading back to the executive hallway. A very senior part of management. I nodded. That is fair to say. Before another question could be asked, someone knocked softly on the open door. Daniel Harper stepped inside, carrying the same folder from the meeting. I hope I am not interrupting. I stood. Not at all. Daniel smiled warmly at my parents. I forgot to give Ethan one of the reports from this morning. He handed me the folder, then looked back toward my father and mother. Have you had the grand tour yet? My mother smiled politely. Not yet. Daniel laughed. Then allow me to steal a few minutes. Visitors rarely get to see how everything comes together around here. My father looked surprised. You do not have another meeting? I do, Daniel replied. But this is worth a short delay. We walked together through several departments connected to the executive floor. Daniel greeted employees by name as we passed, occasionally stopping to explain how different teams work together. Every few minutes someone waved at me or asked a quick question about an ongoing project. I answered briefly before continuing down the hallway. My father noticed every interaction. Nobody hesitated when they spoke with me. Nobody appeared nervous. They treated me like someone they trusted. Daniel eventually stopped in front of a large digital display showing projects underway across multiple states. This is one of Ethan's favorite tools, he explained. It gives us a real-time picture of everything happening across the company. My mother studied the colorful dashboard. This all belongs to your company. Daniel smiled. To our company. Ethan helped design the system after noticing that different departments were solving the same problems without communicating. My father looked at me. You created this? Not alone, I answered. Hundreds of people contributed. I simply helped organize the process. Daniel chuckled softly. That is Ethan in one sentence. He always shares the credit. We continued toward another workspace where several analysts were reviewing financial models on large screens. One of them noticed us and smiled. Good afternoon, Ethan. How is everything looking? I asked. Better than expected, she replied. The improvements from last quarter are still outperforming projections. She smiled toward my parents. You raised a remarkable son. After we left the department, my father remained unusually quiet. Daniel seemed to notice. Richard, he said kindly, may I tell you something? My father nodded. When Ethan joined this company, we hired him because he asked thoughtful questions during the interview. Most candidates wanted to impress us with answers. Ethan wanted to understand people first. My mother listened carefully. Daniel continued. He was never the loudest person in the room. He did not try to compete for attention. Instead, he quietly solved problems that everyone else accepted as normal. We stopped outside another conference room overlooking the city. Daniel folded his hands. 5 years ago, we faced serious operational challenges. Different departments worked hard, but they rarely worked together. Ethan proposed a completely different approach. Some people doubted him because he was younger than many senior managers. Instead of arguing, he built a small pilot program. The results spoke for themselves. Today, that same system supports every division in this company. My father slowly shook his head. I had no idea. Daniel smiled gently. Most people outside this building do not. Ethan has never cared about recognition. He cares about making things work. My father lowered his eyes for a moment before asking quietly, is that why everyone here respects him? Daniel answered without hesitation. No, they respect him because he respects them first. Those words seemed to settle deeply inside my father. We returned to my office a few minutes later. Daniel excused himself and headed toward his delayed meeting after shaking my parents' hands once again. Once the door closed behind him, the room became quiet. My mother looked around the office one more time before turning toward me. Ethan, she asked softly, how long has your life looked like this? I leaned back in my chair and smiled. Longer than you probably think. My father frowned slightly. Years? Yes. He stared at the floor for several moments before speaking again. Then why did you never tell us any of this? I looked at both of them before answering honestly. I tried in the beginning. My father slowly raised his eyes. What do you mean? I folded my hands together on the table. There were several times I started explaining what I was working on, but the conversation usually changed before I finished. Eventually, I realized neither of you were asking because you wanted to understand. You were asking because you had already decided what the answer would be. After a while, I stopped trying to convince anyone. I decided it was better to let my work speak for itself than spend my energy defending a life that already made me happy. My mother looked down at the family photograph sitting on my desk, and I could see her expression beginning to change as memories slowly returned to her, including conversations that had ended long before I ever finished telling my side of the story. Edit. My mother remained silent for several long moments, her eyes fixed on the framed family photograph resting on the corner of my desk. It was taken nearly 6 years earlier during my parents' 40th wedding anniversary celebration. Everyone in the picture was smiling, but as she looked at it now, I could almost see her replaying everything that had happened since then. My father slowly leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. The confidence that had always filled his voice was gone. Instead, there was uncertainty. "I do not remember cutting you off," he admitted quietly. I smiled gently because I believed him. "That is the thing about conversations like those," I said. "The person speaking usually remembers every interruption. The person interrupting often does not remember doing it." Neither of my parents answered. They simply listened. "Do you remember when I called after my first promotion?" I asked. My mother looked up immediately. "You called after work one evening." I nodded. "I wanted to tell you about it because I was excited." Before I could explain the position, Dad asked whether I had finally found a company with better benefits. My father lowered his eyes. I continued calmly. I tried to explain that the promotion was at the same company, but the conversation turned into advice about applying somewhere else. Eventually, we started talking about Olivia's new client instead. My mother slowly covered her mouth with one hand. "I remember that phone call now." I smiled, although there was sadness behind it. "I do too." My father took a slow breath. "I honestly thought I was helping." "I know," I answered. "That is why I never became angry." He looked surprised. "You were never angry?" I shook my head. "No. Disappointed sometimes. Hurt occasionally. But not angry. I knew both of you wanted what you believed was best for me. The difficult part was realizing you had already decided what success should look like before asking what my life actually looked like." My mother wiped the corner of one eye. "I cannot believe we never noticed." "There were signs," I said gently. "You just interpreted them differently." My father looked around my office again. "You mean the apartment?" "Yes." He frowned slightly. "I thought you stayed there because you could not afford a house." I smiled. "I stayed because I liked walking to work. I liked having restaurants, parks, and bookstores a few blocks away. I never wanted a larger house simply because people expected me to buy one." My mother looked thoughtful. "And your truck?" I laughed softly. "You both thought I kept driving it because I could not replace it." My father gave an embarrassed smile. "That crossed my mind. I kept it because it runs perfectly. I would rather invest money than impress strangers with a new vehicle." My father slowly nodded. "Every conclusion we reached," he paused before finishing his sentence, "was based on what we assumed instead of what we asked." "Exactly," I replied. "And even when you asked, you often answered for me before I finished speaking." The room became quiet again. Outside the glass windows, the afternoon sunlight reflected across the buildings downtown, while employees continued moving through the executive floor. Life inside the company carried on normally, but inside my office something far more important was changing. My mother looked at me with genuine regret. "I keep thinking about holidays." "Which ones?" I asked. "Almost every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every birthday dinner." Somehow the conversation always ended with your father encouraging you to find something bigger. She shook her head. "We never asked whether you were already happy." I smiled gently. Happiness was never really part of the conversation. My father rested his elbows on his knees. "Because I thought ambition always meant wanting more." "Sometimes it does," I answered. "Sometimes ambition means building something meaningful and protecting the life you already enjoy." My father stared quietly at the carpet before speaking again. "Did Olivia know?" I thought for a moment. "Not really. She knew I enjoyed my work, but we rarely discussed titles or salaries. We talked about books, baseball, travel, and family. She respected my privacy." My mother sighed softly. "We compared both of you for years without realizing neither of you wanted that." "Olivia never asked to become the standard," I replied. "She worked hard and deserved everything she earned. The comparison was never fair to either of us." My father nodded slowly. "I spent so much time measuring accomplishments that I stopped paying attention to the person standing in front of me." Before I could answer, there was another light knock at the open door. Melissa stepped inside carrying a small folder. "I apologize for interrupting. Ethan, these just came from accounting for your review." "Thank you," I said. As she placed the folder on my desk, She smiled warmly toward my parents. I hope you are enjoying the visit. My mother smiled back. Very much. Melissa hesitated for a second before adding something that neither of my parents expected. I have worked with Ethan for almost 4 years now. I just wanted to tell you something. My father looked at her curiously. Of course. She smiled. People here admire Ethan because he never makes anyone feel unimportant. Whether he is speaking with a new intern or a senior executive, he gives every person the same attention and respect. That is much rarer than you might imagine. My father quietly thanked her. After she left, neither of my parents spoke for several moments. Finally, my father looked directly at me, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it before. All these years I kept hoping one day you would become successful enough for me to feel proud. Standing here today, I am beginning to wonder if the real problem was that I never understood what success actually looked like. My father's words remained in the air long after he finished speaking. For the first time in my life, I saw him questioning a belief that had guided him for decades. He had always measured success by visible achievements because that was how he had built his own life. He believed long hours, steady promotions, and financial security were proof that someone had made the right choices. I never blamed him for thinking that way. Those values had provided our family with a good home, dependable meals, and opportunities that many people never received. The problem was never his work ethic. The problem was believing there was only one way to recognize a meaningful life. I leaned back in my chair and smiled gently. Dad, I have never wanted you to become someone different. I only wished you had been curious enough to ask who I had become. He slowly nodded, absorbing every word. I thought I knew, he admitted. I convinced myself I already had the answers. My mother quietly reached across the table and rested her hand on his arm. Neither of them looked comfortable, but there was something hopeful about the silence. It no longer felt defensive. It felt honest. My father looked around my office once more before speaking again. Can I ask you something? Of course, I answered. When did you stop trying to prove yourself to us? I thought about the question for several seconds because the answer had never been tied to a single day. It happened gradually, I said. At first I believed that one promotion would change everything. Then I thought maybe a larger project would finally convince you. Later I assumed becoming part of the executive team would make a difference. But every milestone happened quietly because I never told you about it. My father frowned. Why not? I smiled gently. Because every time I imagined bringing it up, I could already hear the conversation. You would ask how much money I made. You would compare me with someone else. Or you would suggest another company where I could earn more. Eventually, I realized I was chasing approval instead of enjoying the life I had already built. My mother lowered her eyes. That must have been lonely. Sometimes, I admitted. But I was fortunate. I had friends who believed in me. I had mentors who challenged me. I had coworkers who trusted me. Little by little, I realized I did not need everyone to understand my journey for it to have value. My father slowly rubbed his hands together. I wish I had understood that years ago. Just then my office phone rang. I apologized briefly before answering. One of our directors needed a quick decision regarding a client presentation scheduled for the following week. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. We reviewed the options, agreed on a solution, and ended the call. When I looked back toward my parents, my father was watching me carefully. You did not tell him what to do, he observed. I smiled. No. You ask questions. Instead, usually the people closest to the problem already know the answer, I explained. Sometimes they simply need someone to help them think it through. My father gave a small smile. That sounds different from how I manage people. Different does not mean better, I replied. It is simply what works for me. A few moments later, there was another knock at the door. Daniel stepped inside once again. I promise this is the last interruption. He looked toward my parents with a friendly grin. I was heading out for lunch myself and wanted to invite all of you to join us downstairs if your plans have not changed. I appreciated the invitation, but shook my head. Thank you, Daniel. I think today belongs to my family. He smiled knowingly. I suspected you might say that. Before leaving, he turned toward my father. Richard, may I offer one piece of advice? My father nodded. Please. Daniel folded his arms comfortably. Over the years, I have hired people with extraordinary resumes and impressive degrees. Some succeeded. Some did not. Ethan earned every opportunity here because people trust him. Trust cannot be listed on a resume. It is built one conversation at a time. My father listened carefully. Thank you, he said sincerely. After Daniel left, my mother smiled softly. Everyone keeps talking about your character before they mention your position. I laughed quietly. That is probably the nicest compliment I could receive. My father looked directly at me. You know, all these years I kept asking what your job title was. I never asked what kind of man you were becoming. I felt something inside me begin to relax. Those words meant more than any apology he could have offered at that moment, because they showed he was finally looking beyond the surface. I stood and walked toward the window overlooking the city. Cars moved steadily through the streets below, while people hurried between buildings, each carrying responsibilities that nobody else could fully understand. Dad, I said without turning around, every person you pass on the sidewalk is fighting to build a life that makes sense to them. Some people want larger houses. Others want more time with their families. Some chase promotions. Others chase peace of mind. None of those dreams are automatically better than the others. The room remained quiet until I turned back toward them. My father slowly stood from his chair. His eyes looked different now, softer than I had ever remembered. Ethan, he said carefully, I think today is the first day I have actually seen the life you built instead of the one I imagined you should have built. My mother nodded in agreement, but before either of them could say anything more, my father's phone vibrated in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and frowned slightly before looking back at me. It is Olivia, he said. She is asking how lunch is going. I do not even know where to begin explaining what we have discovered today. Edit. My father looked at the phone in his hand for several seconds before answering the call. He pressed the speaker button without saying a word. Hi, Dad, Olivia said cheerfully. Did you and Mom make it to lunch with Ethan? My father looked at me, then at my mother. Yes, he answered quietly. We found him. Olivia laughed. Well, I hope he did not get stuck in another meeting. My father smiled faintly. Actually, that is exactly where we found him. There was a brief pause. Really? Olivia asked. I thought Tuesdays were usually busy for him. My father looked surprised. You knew that? Of course, Olivia replied. He told me months ago that Tuesday executive meetings usually take most of the morning. My father exchanged a confused glance with my mother. Why did you never tell us? Olivia hesitated before answering. Because Ethan asked me not to. He never wanted anyone in the family to feel uncomfortable. Besides, every time he tried talking about work, the conversation usually went somewhere else. My mother slowly lowered her head. We did that. Yes, Olivia answered gently. You did. Nobody spoke for several moments. Olivia continued in a calm voice. I have wanted to say something for a long time, but I never knew whether it was my place. Ethan was never hiding his life. He simply stopped explaining it after realizing nobody was really listening. My father's shoulders seemed to sink a little lower. I wish someone had told me. Dad, Olivia replied kindly, people tried. You just believed you already knew the whole story. The words were not spoken with anger. They were simply honest. After ending the call, my father remained silent for a long time. Finally, he looked at me. Even your sister understood something I completely missed. I smiled gently. She listened. My mother looked around my office once more before quietly asking, Can we still take you to lunch? I laughed softly. I thought that was the plan all along. We left the executive floor together and took the elevator back to the lobby. This time my parents noticed details they had overlooked only an hour earlier. Employees greeted me by name as they crossed the lobby. Security officers smiled and wished us a pleasant afternoon. A young analyst passing through the entrance thanked me for helping her prepare for an important presentation. My father acknowledged each interaction without saying much. He no longer looked confused. Instead, he seemed to be collecting small pieces of evidence that all pointed toward the same conclusion. We walked to a nearby family restaurant a few blocks from the office. It was quiet, comfortable, and familiar, exactly the kind of place I enjoyed because conversations came more easily there. After we ordered our meals, none of us reached for our phones. My father folded his hands on the table. There is something I need to say. I waited patiently. For years, he began, I believed I was encouraging you. I told myself that pushing you towards something bigger was part of being a good father. I see now that I was not encouraging you. I was refusing to recognize the life you had already built. I remained silent because I wanted him to finish. Every time you tried to tell me about your work, I compared it with my own expectations instead of listening to your experience. I measured your success against my definition instead of asking about yours. He looked directly into my eyes. I am sorry. Those two words were spoken quietly, but they carried more weight than a long speech ever could. My mother reached across the table and gently held my hand. I am sorry too, she said. Looking back, I realize how many opportunities we missed simply because we believed we already understood your life. I smiled warmly at both of them. Thank you. My father looked surprised. That is all you are going to say? I nodded. What else is there to say? He frowned slightly. I expected you to tell us how much we hurt you. I thought about that for a moment before answering. You did hurt me sometimes. But carrying that hurt forever would only waste more years. I would rather spend those years building a better relationship with both of you. My mother's eyes filled with tears. After everything, you are willing to do that? Of course, I replied. You are still my parents. One difficult chapter does not have to become the entire story. Our meals arrived, and for the first time in many years the conversation felt completely different. My father asked questions because he genuinely wanted to know the answers. He asked how my team worked together, what challenges I enjoyed solving, why I chose to stay with the same company instead of accepting offers elsewhere, and what I hope to accomplish over the next few years. He listened without interrupting. My mother smiled as she watched the conversation unfold. More than once she quietly laughed and admitted, I have never heard this story before. I smiled back. That is because today is the first time anyone has let me finish telling it. My father nodded with quiet humility. Then I hope today is only the beginning, because I think I still have a great deal to learn about my own son. Over the next several months, something changed in ways I never expected. The biggest difference was not my career, my office, or even the way my parents spoke about me. The biggest difference was that they finally became curious instead of certain. About 2 weeks after our lunch together, my father called one Saturday morning. Normally, our phone conversations lasted only a few minutes, but this time his first question surprised me. Are you busy today? He asked. Not really, I answered. Why? I was wondering if you would like to come by the house. Not because I need help fixing something. I just thought we could spend the afternoon together. I smiled before answering. I would like that. When I arrived, he already had coffee waiting on the back patio. We spent nearly 3 hours talking. Not once did he ask about promotions, salaries, or job titles. Instead, he asked about the people I worked with, the challenges of leading a team, the books I had been reading, and the lessons I had learned over the years. More than once he stopped himself in the middle of a sentence and laughed. I almost interrupted you again, he admitted. Old habits. I laughed with him. You noticed it yourself? That is progress. He smiled and simply said, Go ahead. I want to hear the rest. Those words meant more to me than he probably realized. A month later, my mother invited Olivia and me over for Sunday dinner. It felt different the moment everyone sat down. In the past, conversations often became quiet competitions without anyone intending them to be. Someone would mention an accomplishment, and another person would compare it with something else. This time, my mother gently guided the conversation in another direction. When Olivia talked about an important legal case, my parents listened with genuine interest instead of turning it into a comparison. When I described a community mentoring program my company had recently launched for local college students, they listened with exactly the same attention. Nobody tried to decide whose work mattered more. Everyone simply enjoyed hearing each other's stories. At one point, Olivia smiled across the table at me and quietly said, This is nice. I nodded because I knew exactly what she meant. The competition had finally disappeared. As autumn arrived, my father surprised me again. He asked if he could visit my office one more time, not because he still questioned what I did, but because he wanted to understand how the business actually operated. On a Friday afternoon, I walked him through several departments, introducing him to managers and team members along the way. This visit felt completely different from the first one. Instead of standing silently in disbelief, he asked thoughtful questions. He wanted to know how different departments coordinated projects, how younger employees developed leadership skills, and why collaboration seemed so important to everyone. Several people stopped to greet us, and each conversation reinforced something he had already begun to understand. Respect was never demanded inside our company. It was earned through consistency, honesty, and trust. As we finished the tour, we stood together near the same window where he had first looked across the city months earlier. He smiled as he watched employees leaving for the weekend. I used to think leadership meant having all the answers, he said quietly. Now I think it begins with asking better questions. I smiled. That lesson applies to families too. He nodded without hesitation. I know. Thanksgiving arrived a few weeks later, And for the first time in years, I looked forward to the holiday without wondering whether another uncomfortable conversation would appear around the dinner table. Our family gathered at my parents' home just as we always had. The same recipes filled the kitchen. The same football game played quietly in the living room. The same laughter echoed through the house. Yet everything somehow felt lighter. Before dinner, my father stood and tapped his glass gently with a spoon. Everyone looked toward him. Even my nieces and nephews became quiet. He cleared his throat before speaking. "I would like to say something before we eat." He looked around the room, then stopped when his eyes reached me. This year, I learned one of the most important lessons of my life. The room remained silent. For a long time, I believed I understood success because I had spent my entire career chasing it. But I confused visible achievements with personal worth. I measured people too quickly, including my own son. My mother reached for his hand as he continued. "I spent years encouraging Ethan to become someone he had already become. The truth was never that he lacked success. The truth was that I lacked understanding." He smiled toward me with quiet humility. "Son, thank you for giving your mother and me another chance to know the man you have become." I felt an unexpected warmth settle over the room. Nobody applauded. Nobody needed to. Olivia smiled proudly while my mother wiped away a tear. My father sat back down beside her, looking more peaceful than I had seen him in years. As we gathered around the table, I realized something that had nothing to do with careers or offices. My life had not changed the day my parents walked into my workplace. It had changed the day they finally walked into the conversation with open minds instead of fixed conclusions. That quiet change had accomplished something no promotion, salary, or title could ever achieve. It had given our family a chance to begin again. Nearly a year has passed since the afternoon my parents unexpectedly walked into my office. And if someone asked me what changed the most, my answer would surprise them. It was not my position. It was not my salary. It was not the respect I received at work, because all of those things already existed before that day. The greatest change happened inside our family. We learned that assumptions can quietly become walls, and those walls often grow so slowly that nobody notices them until they prevent people from truly seeing one another. My father still owns his construction company, but I have noticed small differences in the way he leads his employees. During one visit to his office, I watched him ask one of his younger supervisors, "What do you think we should do?" Afterward, he smiled at me and admitted, "A year ago, I would have answered that question before asking it." I laughed because I knew exactly what he meant. My mother changed in her own quiet way as well. Every Sunday, she began calling simply to ask how I was doing. Sometimes we talked about work, but more often we talked about books, weekend plans, neighborhood events, or recipes she wanted me to try. Those conversations were never rushed. She no longer searched for signs that I needed advice. Instead, she simply enjoyed getting to know her son as an adult. Olivia noticed the difference too. One afternoon we met for coffee, and she smiled as she stirred her drink. "You know," she said, "our parents actually listen now." I laughed. I noticed. She nodded thoughtfully. "It feels like they stopped trying to manage our lives and started appreciating them instead." She was right. The atmosphere around our family had become calmer because nobody felt the need to prove anything anymore. The comparisons disappeared. The quiet competition disappeared. Even holiday dinners felt lighter because conversations became opportunities to learn instead of opportunities to evaluate. Several months later, my company hosted a community leadership event for local college students interested in business careers. My parents attended as guests, sitting quietly near the back of the room while I answered questions from students about leadership, teamwork, and personal growth. One student stood up and asked, "What is the biggest lesson you have learned during your career?" I paused for a moment before answering honestly. Never confuse someone's current circumstances with their potential, and never assume you understand another person's journey before listening to it. As I spoke those words, I glanced toward my parents. My father smiled with quiet understanding because he knew that lesson belonged to both of us. After the event ended, several students stayed behind to ask additional questions. One young man looked nervous as he explained that his family believed he was making the wrong career choice. I listened carefully before offering the same advice I had slowly learned myself. "You cannot control when people understand your journey," I told him. "You can only control whether you continue building it with integrity." As he thanked me and walked away, my father approached quietly. "You were not only talking to him, were you?" I smiled. "No." He nodded. I did not think so. On the drive home that evening, my father became unusually reflective. I spent years believing parents teach their children how to succeed, he said. I never imagined my son would end up teaching me something much more important. I looked over and smiled. We taught each other. He shook his head gently. Maybe, but you showed more patience than I deserved. I did not answer immediately because I wanted my words to be completely honest. Dad, forgiveness becomes much easier when you realize someone made a mistake out of misunderstanding instead of cruelty. He quietly nodded, and neither of us felt the need to say anything else for several miles. Some lessons do not require long conversations. They simply need time to settle into the heart. Looking back now, I realized the greatest irony of the entire experience. My parents believed I was struggling because they judged my life by what they could see from the outside. They saw an older truck instead of financial wisdom. They saw a modest apartment instead of intentional choices. They saw quiet confidence and mistaken it for limited ambition. They filled in the missing pieces with assumptions because assumptions are often easier than questions. Yet the moment they stepped into my workplace, nothing about me changed. I was the same son I had been the day before. The only thing that changed was what they finally allowed themselves to see. That realization stayed with all of us. Today, whenever our family gathers around the dinner table, my father often smiles before anyone begins telling a story and says, "Let them finish." It has become a simple tradition, but it reminds us of everything we almost lost by believing we already knew each other's lives. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give another person is not advice, approval, or even encouragement. Sometimes the greatest gift is the willingness to listen long enough for the truth to reveal itself. I used to think success would finally earn my parents' respect. Instead, I discovered that understanding earned something far more valuable. It gave us back our family, not because anyone became richer or more important, but because we finally learned to see one another without the weight of old assumptions. That quiet change became the greatest achievement any of us could have hoped for, and unlike every title, every promotion, or every paycheck, it is a legacy that will remain with our family for generations to come.